The drawing-room curtains at number 12 Saltcliffe Street were a testament to genteel poverty. Their once rich velvet worn to a fragile skin in the places the sun touched most fiercely. Constance Ingram sat on a low stool before them, a needle in her hand, her task to weave life back into the lifeless. Good thread is wasted on old fabric, her aunt, Mrs. Theodosia Corbett, had declared that morning, her voice laced with a particular cruelty she reserved for pronouncements of economy. But your hands are free, Constance, and your time is of no consequence. It was true. Since the death of her parents 5 years prior, Constance's hands had been perpetually occupied, her time rendered worthless. Her modest inheritance, a sum of £200 a year, was managed by her aunt, who provided Constance with a small attic room, plain board, and a litany of tasks that were, in reality, the full and silent administration of the household. It was Constance who balanced the ledgers, Constance who managed the cook's temper and the butcher's bills, Constance who could stretch a pound until it cried for mercy. Her cousin Philippa, a girl of placid beauty and profound indolence, did nothing but arrange flowers and practice her watercolors, while Mrs. Corbett held court in the drawing-room, accepting praise for its smooth running. Constance pushed the needle through the brittle fabric. The thread, a cheap cotton, was indeed ill-suited to the velvet, but it was all her aunt would provide. She worked with the quiet, methodical precision that defined all her actions. She did not sigh. She did not allow her shoulders to slump. She had learned long ago, in the first raw months of her grief and dependency, that such displays changed nothing. Tears were a currency she did not possess and could not afford to spend. Instead, she focused on the geometry of the stitches, the small, neat anchors she was setting against the inevitable decay. Each stitch was an act of defiance, a refusal to be as frayed and useless as the material in her hands. She thought of the numbers in the household account book, crisp and black and unarguable. She thought of the pantry shelves, arranged not for beauty, but for logic, oldest to newest, left to right. These were her small, invisible kingdoms of order in a world of quiet chaos. The front bell chimed, a sharp, imperious sound that sliced through the afternoon quiet. A visitor of importance, then, not one of the usual town gossips. Constance continued her work, her presence in the room as unassuming as a piece of furniture. Peg, the housemaid, scurried past the doorway, her footsteps quickening. A moment later, a man's voice, low and clipped, carried from the hall. It was a voice that did not ask for attention, but commanded it by its very restraint. "Mrs. Corbett," the voice stated, not inquired. "Mr. Lockhart, what an unexpected honor," her aunt's voice gushed, the false honey of it setting Constance's teeth on edge. "Do come in, do. Philippa, my dear, Mr. Lockhart is here." Constance's needle paused mid-stitch. Mr. Gideon Lockhart. The name was a story in Marley. The new master of Alderbrook, the sprawling, derelict estate that loomed on the edge of the moor, a place of ghost stories and overgrown gardens. He had returned from the war a hero, they said, but a broken one. A widower, his young wife lost to a fever while he was away fighting. He was impossibly wealthy, ruthlessly private, and had been seen in town only a handful of times. A tall, grim figure who moved with a stillness that was more intimidating than any swagger. She heard them enter the drawing-room, and she made to rise, to fade away as was expected of her. But her aunt's voice, sharp and proprietary, stopped her. "Constance, stay. You may as well finish your work." It was a demonstration of power. "See this man of importance? Even in his presence you are nothing but a mender of rags." Constance inclined her head and returned to her stool, her world shrinking to the needle and the thread. She kept her eyes down, her back to the room's occupants, presenting them only with the neat coil of her brown hair and the drab gray of her dress. "I will not take much of your time," Mr. Lockhart's voice said. It was closer now. He had a quality of absolute stillness. She had not heard him approach. "I am in need of a service." "Anything, dear sir, anything at all," Mrs. Corbett purred. "We are, after all, distant cousins, are we not? My late husband always spoke so fondly of your father." A beat of silence. "I am looking for a housekeeper," he said, cutting through the effusive chatter. "On a temporary basis. Alderbrook must be made presentable for a surveyor's valuation. The task requires competence." The word hung in the air, clean and sharp. "Competence! Well, you have come to the right place," Mrs. Corbett declared triumphantly. "My Philippa, while young, is remarkably gifted in the domestic arts. She has a wonderful eye for arrangement and manages our staff with such grace." Constance felt a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. Philippa could not manage to find a matching pair of stockings without assistance. "I see," Mr. Lockhart said. His tone was non-committal, but Constance could feel his gaze sweeping the room. She felt it pass over her, a fleeting, indifferent assessment, before moving on. She was part of the room's shabby decor. "Philippa, my love," Mrs. Corbett prompted. "It is a very large house, is it not, Mr. Lockhart?" Philippa asked, her voice a soft, pretty murmur. "It must be terribly gloomy." "It is large. It is neglected. It is not gloomy," he replied, each statement a granite block. "The position would require managing a budget, hiring local staff for the heavy cleaning, taking a full inventory of the contents, and preparing a section of the house for my residents. The work is to be completed in 3 months. Just then, as if on cue to prove Mrs. Corbett's claims a lie, a small disaster unfolded. Peg entered with the tea tray, her face flushed. In her haste to impress, she stumbled on the edge of the worn rug, and the tray tilted precariously. A cup and saucer clattered to the floor, and a stream of hot tea went splashing across the polished wood and onto the corner of a delicate escritoire. Philippa shrieked softly. Mrs. Corbett gasped in fury, "Clumsy girl!" But Constance was already moving. She set her needlework aside, rose in a single fluid motion, and went not to the mess, but to the small pot of beeswax and turpentine she kept on a low shelf for polishing the furniture. With a clean rag from her work basket, she was at the escritoire before Peg had even managed to set the tray down safely. She ignored the broken china. She ignored her aunt's rising tirade. Her focus was entirely on the spill. Hot liquid could permanently mar the French polish. She swiftly, gently blotted the tea from the inlaid wood, her touch light and sure. Then she applied a tiny amount of the wax, rubbing it in with firm, circular motions until the wood shone again, the brief blush of the spill completely gone. The entire act took less than 30 seconds. When she was done, she straightened up and found Mr. Gideon Lockhart watching her. His eyes were not on the restored furniture, but on her hands, on the quiet efficiency of her movements. His gaze was intense, analytical, like a scholar examining a rare specimen. It was not the gaze men usually gave women. It was not admiring, nor was it dismissive. It was assessing. He had overlooked her as part of the shabby room. But in that small, competent act, she had suddenly come into sharp focus. Mrs. Corbett, having finished scolding the weeping Peg, turned back to her guest, her smile replastered. "You see the trials of managing a household. But as I was saying, Philippa—" "Who are you?" Mr. Lockhart asked. The question was not directed at Mrs. Corbett. It was directed at Constance. It was so direct, so devoid of social preamble, that it silenced the room. Constance's hands stilled. She met his gaze. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, gray and remote. "I am Constance Ingram, sir, Mrs. Corbett's niece." "It was you who balanced my aunt's ledgers last month, was it not?" he continued. Another clean, sharp question. Mrs. Corbett stiffened. "My niece merely assists with the arithmetic. A woman's mind isn't suited to complex figures." Mr. Lockhart's gaze did not leave Constance's face. "The ledgers were not merely assisted with. They were corrected. I saw them when settling a small debt of your late husband's. There were annotations in a fine, clear hand, noting discrepancies in the butcher's accounts dating back 6 months. Was that your hand?" Constance felt her aunt's glare like a physical blow to the side of her head. She lifted her chin. She would not lie for her aunt's vanity. Not about this. Her numbers were her own. "Yes, sir, it was." He gave a single decisive nod. The assessment was over. The conclusion reached. He turned his attention back to a stunned Mrs. Corbett. "I am grateful for your offer of Miss Corbett's assistance," he said, the formal words carrying a sharp edge of dismissal. "But I believe Miss Ingram possesses the specific qualities I require: competence and an eye for detail." The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth from the space. Philippa stared, her pretty face a mask of confusion. Mrs. Corbett's complexion had gone from flushed to a mottled, dangerous white. Constance stood perfectly still, the rag still in her hand, feeling as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. He had seen her. In a room where she was trained to be invisible, this grim, silent man had looked past the decorative cousin and the domineering aunt, and had seen her. "Miss Ingram?" Mrs. Corbett's voice was a venomous whisper. "Constance is a delicate girl, wholly unsuited for such a monumental task. She has no experience managing a great house." "She has experience managing yours," Mr. Lockhart stated flatly. It was not an insult. It was a fact. "And she knows the value of a good polish." His eyes flickered to the gleaming corner of the escritoire. He then addressed Constance directly once more, his tone shifting from analytical to transactional. "The position is for 3 months. The salary is £10 per week. Your task is to make Alderbrook functional. Are you interested, Miss Ingram?" £10 a week. It was a fortune. It was more than she had ever been allowed to touch of her own money. It was a key, a door, a possibility of escape so dazzling it made her feel faint. She could feel her aunt's fury radiating across the room, a silent, screaming demand that she refuse, that she remember her place, that she remain the mender of curtains, the invisible cog in the machine. But Mr. Lockhart was waiting for an answer. He was not looking at her aunt. He was looking at her. And in his cool, gray eyes, she saw not kindness, but something far more valuable: recognition. He saw what she could do. She took a breath, her first real breath of the afternoon. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am interested." The battle, when it came, was fought not in front of Mr. Lockhart, but in the suffocating privacy of Mrs. Corbett's private sitting room. "How dare you?" her aunt hissed, her face contorted with a rage that stripped away all her practiced gentility. "How dare you accept such a thing without my permission? You, with your meek little ways, playing the martyr. You engineered this." "I did nothing but what you told me to do," Constance replied, her voice low and even. "I mended the curtains. I polished the furniture. He saw what he saw. He saw a schemer, an upstart." Mrs. Corbett paced the small room like a caged animal. "You have humiliated me. You have humiliated Philippa. That position was hers by right." Constance remained silent. There was no arguing with this particular brand of delusion. She simply stood, her hands clasped before her, a posture of quiet endurance she had perfected over 5 years. Finally, her aunt stopped pacing, and a sly, calculating look entered her eyes. The rage had burned itself out, replaced by something far more dangerous: avarice. "Very well," she said slowly. "If you are so determined to play the grand lady at Alderbrook, then you shall. But you are still under my care. A young, unmarried woman cannot simply go off and handle her own finances. It would be improper. His payments will be made directly to me. I will manage them for you, as I do your inheritance. For your own protection, of course." It was theft, plain and simple, a cage of a different sort. Constance had seen a glimmer of freedom, and her aunt was already slamming the door shut. For a moment, a wave of pure despair washed over her. She would trade one prison for another, her labor enriching her jailer just the same. But then she thought of Alderbrook, the silent, neglected house, the overgrown gardens, a space where she would not be watched and belittled every moment of the day, a place where her competence would be the currency, not her silence. Even if she saw none of the money, she would have the work. She would have a purpose that was her own. And she would be away from here. For 3 months, she would be free of the cloying perfume of her aunt's hypocrisy and the weight of Philippa's uselessness. "As you wish, Aunt," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within her. Mrs. Corbett looked surprised by her quick capitulation. "And you will write to me weekly," she added, imposing another shackle. "I will need to know that everything is being managed to Mr. Lockhart's satisfaction." "Of course," Constance agreed. A contract was drawn up by Mr. Lockhart's solicitor the next day. It was simple, direct, and utterly devoid of sentiment, just like the man himself. It stipulated her duties, the timeline of 3 months, and the salary of £10 per week, payable to Mrs. Theodosia Corbett for the care and administration of her niece, Miss Constance Ingram. Constance signed it with a steady hand. Mr. Lockhart watched her, his expression unreadable. He made no comment on the arrangement, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, but a kind of hard, knowing acknowledgement. He understood the dynamics of power and dependency. He had seen it all in a single afternoon. 2 days later, a simple cart arrived to take her and her single trunk to Alderbrook. Philippa gave her a confused, slightly resentful farewell. "I do hope you'll be warm enough, Constance. They say it's a dreadfully draughty house." Mrs. Corbett's parting words were delivered with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Remember your place, my dear. You are there to serve. Do not get ideas above your station." As the cart rumbled out of Marley and onto the winding road towards the moor, Constance did not look back. She looked forward, towards the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the Alderbrook estate. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and pine. It felt clean. It felt real. She was not a delicate girl. She was not a schemer. She was a woman who knew how to work. And for the first time in 5 years, she was on her way to a place that needed her. Alderbrook was not a house. It was a sleeping giant, shrouded in ivy and silence. The cart pulled up before a grand Palladian facade, its stone stained gray with weather and neglect. Windows stared out like vacant eyes coated in a film of grime. The driver, a taciturn man named Jem, unloaded her trunk onto the weed-choked gravel. "Mr. Lockhart said you'd have the key," he grunted, and with the tip of his hat he was gone. The key was heavy and iron, cold in her hand. It turned in the lock with a groan of protest, and the great oak doors swung inward, releasing a breath of air that was cold, musty, and utterly still. Constance stepped inside. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows, its checkered marble floor veiled in a layer of dust so thick it softened the edges of everything. Furniture huddled under ghostly white dustcloths. A grand staircase swept upwards into the gloom. The silence was absolute, a living presence. It was not the resentful silence of her aunt's house, but a deep, patient silence, waiting. She set down her small bag. There was no one to greet her, no fire in the hearth. Mr. Lockhart, she had been told, was occupying a small suite of rooms in the west wing and would not be disturbed. Her domain was the rest of this sleeping beast. For a moment, the sheer scale of the task was overwhelming. The dust, the decay, the silence. Where did one even begin? She began as she always did, with a single, manageable step. She took off her bonnet and gloves, rolled up the sleeves of her practical gray dress, and went in search of the kitchens. She found them at the back of the house, a vast, stone-flagged space with a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Here, the neglect felt less like abandonment and more like a long, deep slumber. Copper pots, tarnished to a dull brown, hung from racks. A thick wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface scored with the marks of 1,000 meals. It was here she met Hannah. The woman was sitting at the table, a gnarled, formidable figure with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut. She was polishing a small silver salt cellar with a ferocity that seemed wholly out of proportion to the task. She did not look up when Constance entered. "They sent you then?" Hannah said, her voice rough as granite. "Another one. Think you'll last the week?" "I am Miss Ingram," Constance said quietly. "Mr. Lockhart has hired me to oversee the house." "I know who you are," the old woman grunted, still rubbing at the silver. "I'm Hannah. Been housekeeper here since before the master was born. Now I'm just part of the inventory." There was a world of bitterness in her tone. Constance did not try to placate her with false cheerfulness. She walked over to the stone sink, where a collection of dulled kitchen knives lay in a wooden block. She picked one up, a heavy cleaver, and ran her thumb carefully over the blade. It was blunt, worn from years of use and neglect. "A good knife is the heart of a kitchen," Constance said, more to herself than to the old woman. She found the sharpening stone near the hearth, coated in dust. She wiped it clean, wet it from the hand pump, and began to draw the blade across its surface. The sound of steel on stone, rhythmic and scraping, filled the silence. Shh, 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 shh. It was a working sound, an honest sound. Hannah finally stopped polishing and watched her, her head cocked. Constance did not hurry. She worked the blade with an even pressure, turning it, feeling for the burr, her movements economical and sure. It was a skill her father, a man who believed in practical knowledge for all his children, had taught her. After several minutes, she wiped the blade clean and held it up. It gleamed in the dim light. She took a withered turnip from a nearby basket, and with a single, swift chop, sliced it cleanly in two. She laid the cleaver down. "That should hold an edge for a while," she said. She looked at Hannah, whose fierce expression had softened into something like grudging respect. "You know your way around a blade," the old woman admitted. "I know my way around a household," Constance corrected gently. "And this household needs to wake up. Will you help me, Hannah?" For the first time, Hannah met her eyes directly. A long moment passed. Then, The old housekeeper gave a stiff, short nod. "The first thing we'll need is wood for this hearth, and a mountain of lye soap. The real work begins at dawn." It was a start. It was an alliance. That night, Constance slept not in the grand, cold bedrooms upstairs, but on a small cot in a former servant's room off the kitchen, a room she had swept clean herself. It was small, it was plain, but it was hers. And as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she could hear the slow, deep breathing of the great house all around her, as if, in some small way, her presence had already begun to stir it from its long dream. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of relentless, satisfying work. Constance and Hannah, a formidable duo of quiet competence, began their assault on the decay of Alderbrook. They started with the heart of the house, the kitchens and storerooms, and worked their way outward. They scrubbed floors, beat carpets until clouds of dust billowed like smoke, and mixed gallons of beeswax and lavender polish to feed the thirsty wood of the furniture. Constance hired 2 strong girls from the village, Tilly and Bess, to help with the heavy lifting, paying them a fair wage from the budget Mr. Lockhart had provided. Her management was not one of barking orders, but of quiet demonstration. She showed the girls how to properly air a mattress, how to clean soot-stained marble without scratching it, how to wash and press fine linen. Her authority came not from her station, but from her knowledge. She knew how things were done. Mr. Lockhart remained a distant presence. Constance would sometimes see him from a window, walking the overgrown paths of the estate, his tall frame rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He never stopped, never spoke to her, but she felt his observation. He would have seen the windows, once opaque with grime, now letting in the pale autumn sunlight. He would have smelled the clean scents of soap and wax replacing the must of decay. He would have heard the sounds of work, of life, returning to the silent halls. One afternoon, while taking inventory of the vast, cold library, she found a ledger belonging to his late wife. It was a book of household accounts, much like the ones she kept, but it was filled with more than just numbers. In the margins were sketches of flowers, notes on poetry, and pressed leaves. It was the record of a vibrant, joyful life. Constance felt a pang of sorrow for the silent man who walked the grounds alone. She closed the book gently and placed it in a locked drawer, a private history she had no right to disturb further. Her own private kingdom became the neglected herb garden. Tucked away behind a crumbling stone wall, it was a tangle of weeds and thorns. But beneath the chaos, the ghosts of its former glory remained. She found hardy survivors: woody rosemary, stubborn thyme, a sprawling mint that had conquered a whole corner. Every evening, for an hour before dusk, Constance would work there. She would pull weeds, her hands bare in the cool earth, and slowly, painstakingly, begin to clear the beds. She found it was not unlike her work inside the house, bringing order from chaos, nurturing what was salvageable, and giving it space to breathe. Hannah found her there one evening, her silhouette dark against the setting sun. "Wasting your time on weeds," the old housekeeper grumbled, though there was no heat in it. "It's not a waste," Constance said, holding up a sprig of rosemary. "This is for the roast lamb on Sunday, and the thyme will be good for a cough." Hannah just grunted, but the next morning, Constance found a set of old, well-oiled gardening tools left neatly by the garden gate. It was Hannah's gruff version of a blessing. The transformation of Alderbrook was slow, but it was undeniable. Fires now crackled in the hearths of the main rooms. The silver, polished to a brilliant shine, reflected the flickering candlelight. The air was clean, the floors gleamed, and the scent of baking bread often drifted from the kitchens. The house was beginning to breathe again. One evening, Mr. Lockhart appeared at the door of the small study where Constance was working on the inventory. She had not heard him approach. "Miss Ingram," he said. She rose to her feet. "Mr. Lockhart." He held out a small leather-bound book. "I found this in the East Wing. It is a treatise on the cultivation of medicinal herbs. I noted your work in the garden. I thought it might be of use." She took the book. Its pages were filled with detailed botanical drawings and elegant script. It was a valuable volume. "Thank you, sir. That is very thoughtful." "It is practical," he corrected, his voice as clipped as ever. "A well-stocked herb garden is an asset to an estate." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the neat stacks of paper on her desk, the clean lines of her inkwell and pen. "The house feels different." "It is cleaner, sir," she offered. "No," he said, after a moment's thought. "It is not just cleaner. It is coherent. There is a logic to it now." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than cool assessment in his eyes. It was a flicker of warmth, as brief and as startling as a flash of lightning in a winter sky. "You have done good work." He turned and left as silently as he had arrived, leaving Constance with the book in her hands and a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. It was not praise for her beauty or her charm, things she had never possessed. It was praise for her mind, for her ability to create order. And from this man, that felt more profound than any flowery compliment. The house was changing, and it seemed its master was, too. The first sign of trouble arrived in a perfumed letter. Mrs. Corbett announced her intention to visit, along with Philippa, to "see how my poor dear niece is faring in that great, lonely house." Constance read the words with a sense of deep foreboding. Her 3 months of peace were drawing to a close, and the outside world, with all its petty cruelties, was about to intrude. They arrived on a Tuesday, their carriage a garish splash of color against the muted tones of Alderbrook. Mrs. Corbett swept into the hall, which was now warm, clean, and welcoming, and her eyes widened almost comically. She had clearly expected to find Constance struggling in a hovel of dust and squalor. "My goodness," she breathed, running a gloved finger along a polished table. It came away clean. "You have been busy." The words were meant as a compliment, but they landed like an accusation. Philippa trailed behind her, looking around with a sort of vague wonder. "It's not nearly so gloomy as I imagined," she said. "It's almost pretty." Constance greeted them with practiced civility, offering them tea in the small drawing room, where a fire crackled and the newly cleaned windows looked out onto the tamed lawns. The curtains were still the old ones, but they had been washed, pressed, and rehung so that their worn patches were less obvious. Mrs. Corbett's tour of the house was more of an interrogation. She inspected every room, her sharp eyes searching for flaws, for any sign that Constance was not up to the task. But there were none to be found. The house was immaculate. The inventories were orderly. The kitchen was a model of efficiency. With every new proof of Constance's competence, her aunt's expression grew tighter, her smile more brittle. This was not the narrative she had intended. Her downtrodden niece was not supposed to flourish. "You seem to be managing well enough," she said, her voice thin. "Perhaps too well. One might think you were making yourself a little too at home, Constance." The visit culminated in a dinner with Mr. Lockhart, an event Constance had dreaded. Her aunt was on her most winning form, flattering their host and subtly belittling Constance at every turn. "She was always such a quiet, plain little thing," she said with a laugh, as if sharing a fond memory. "We never imagined she had such ambition." Mr. Lockhart, however, was impervious to her aunt's sycophantic chatter. He answered her questions with curt, factual responses and directed his own infrequent remarks to Constance, asking about the progress of the inventory or the state of the roof. He treated her not as a servant, but as a colleague. It was during this tense dinner that Mr. Lucien Devereux was announced. A handsome, polished man with an easy smile, he was a neighboring landowner who had made no secret of his desire to acquire Alderbrook. He greeted Mrs. Corbett and Philippa with practiced charm, his eyes lingering on Philippa's pretty face. But his real attention, Constance sensed, was on Mr. Lockhart. "Gideon, my dear fellow," Devereux said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I was just passing and saw the lights. The old place looks alive again. You must be preparing for the sale." "I am preparing the house," Lockhart replied coolly, shrugging off the familiar hand. Devereux's gaze slid to Constance. "And this must be the miracle worker I've heard so much about in Marley." His smile was charming, but his eyes were cold and assessing. "They say you've tamed the beast of Alderbrook, Miss Ingram." The whispers in Marley. Constance felt a chill. Her aunt had clearly been busy, painting a picture of her as a conniving upstart. The conversation turned to the estate, with Devereux making light, probing comments about its state of disrepair, subtly devaluing it. "It'll take a fortune to make this place truly habitable, Gideon. The land is sour, the roof is a sieve. You'd be wise to accept a fair offer and be rid of the burden." "I am aware of the estate's condition," Lockhart said. "Miss Ingram is compiling a thorough report." This seemed to irritate Devereux. He had expected Lockhart to be overwhelmed, desperate to sell. Constance's competence was an obstacle to his plans of acquiring the estate cheaply. The visit from her aunt was not just a social call. It was the first move in a campaign against her. They saw her not as a housekeeper, but as a guardian of Alderbrook's true value, and therefore an enemy. When they finally left, Mrs. Corbett gave Constance a parting shot. "Do be careful, dear," she whispered, her voice dripping with false concern. "Men like Mr. Lockhart can be easily influenced. A girl in your position must be beyond reproach. Reputations are so very fragile." It was a threat. And as Constance watched their carriage disappear down the drive, she knew that the quiet peace of Alderbrook was over. A storm was gathering, and she was at its center. The opposition was no longer just snubs and whispers. It had a face and a name. And Mr. Lucien Devereux looked like a man who did not like to lose. The attack, when it came, was both insidious and brutal. A week after the visit, Mr. Devereux called again, this time accompanied by Mrs. Corbett. They arrived under the pretense of delivering a pot of jam to poor, isolated Constance. Their true purpose was far more sinister. While Mr. Devereux engaged Mr. Lockhart in a conversation about land drainage in the study, a conversation designed to be both long and boring, Mrs. Corbett insisted on seeing Constance's humble little room. "I do worry so that you're not comfortable, my dear," she said, her hand on Constance's arm, a gesture of false intimacy that made Constance's skin crawl. Reluctantly, Constance led her to the small, neat room off the kitchen. It was sparse, but impeccably clean. Her few belongings were tidily arranged. Mrs. Corbett looked around, her lips pursed in a semblance of pity. "Oh, you poor child, so Spartan. But you were never one for luxuries, were you?" She fussed around the room, straightening a book, adjusting the curtain. "I'll just leave you to your duties, dear. Don't let us be a burden." Her visit to the room lasted less than 2 minutes. It was all the time she needed. Later that afternoon, the trap was sprung. The 4 of them, Constance, Lockhart, Mrs. Corbett, and Devereux were gathered in the library. Constance was delivering her weekly progress report to Mr. Lockhart. Mrs. Corbett sighed dramatically. "Gideon," she said, addressing him with a familiarity that grated, "forgive my forwardness, but there is a matter that has been weighing on my heart, a matter of trust." Mr. Lockhart looked up from the ledgers, his face impassive. "Speak plainly, madam." "It is about my niece," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "I am her guardian. Her moral well-being is my sacred duty, and I fear the temptations of a house like this may be too great for a girl of her simple background." Mr. Devereux chimed in, his tone one of grave concern. "We have heard whispers in town, Gideon, unpleasant rumors, that items have been going missing from the estate." Constance felt the blood drain from her face. She stood frozen, the ledger in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "What items?" Lockhart's voice was dangerously quiet. "Small things at first," Mrs. Corbett said, dabbing a dry eye with a handkerchief. "But then, something of great sentimental value. A silver locket, I believe, one that belonged to your late wife." The room went completely still. Constance's mind reeled. The locket. She had seen it once in a portrait of Mrs. Lockhart that hung in the gallery, a delicate, heart-shaped piece on a silver chain. "I see," Lockhart said, his eyes, cold as chips of ice, moving to Constance. "And you believe my housekeeper has stolen it?" "We don't want to believe it," Mrs. Corbett cried. "But she has been acting so strangely, so possessive of the house. I asked her, I pleaded with her to confess, but she denied it. So, with a heavy heart, I searched her room." She held up her hand, and resting in her palm was the gleaming silver locket. "I found it at the bottom of her trunk, hidden beneath her underthings." The locket seemed to burn in the dim light of the library. It was the perfect, irrefutable proof. A valuable, deeply personal item found in the possession of the poor, ambitious niece. The story wrote itself. Devereux stepped forward. "Gideon, I am so sorry you have to face this. The girl has clearly abused your trust. You should dismiss her immediately before she does more damage. We can handle this quietly, for the family's sake." All eyes were on Mr. Lockhart. His face was a mask of stone, utterly unreadable. He looked from the locket in Mrs. Corbett's hand to Constance's pale, shocked face. For one terrible, stretched-out moment, the world seemed to stop. This was the test. Everything she had built, all the trust she thought she had earned through weeks of honest, relentless work, rested on this single point of doubt. She could see the faint lines of grief and past betrayal etched around his eyes. He was a man who had been wounded before, a man for whom trust was a fortress, easily breached and difficult to rebuild. She did not cry. She did not protest her innocence in a flood of panicked words. She had learned long ago that hysteria was an admission of guilt in the eyes of the world. She simply met his gaze, held it, and waited. Her entire defense was in the steadiness of her own eyes, in the quiet refusal of her spirit to break. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then he spoke, his voice low and devoid of all emotion. He did not look at her aunt. He looked only at her. "Miss Ingram," he said, "did you take this?" The question was a lifeline in a raging sea. He was not accusing. He was asking. He was giving her the chance to speak for herself, a courtesy her aunt had never extended. She took a small, steadying breath. "No, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I did not." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The crisis, the moment of fracture, had passed. His trust in her character, a structure built day by day on the foundations of her quiet integrity, had held. Mr. Lockhart's perspective. Gideon watched the scene unfold with a cold, familiar detachment, a skill honed on the battlefield where emotion was a liability. He saw Theodosia Corbett's performance, the over-bright eyes, the trembling hand, theatrical and false. He saw Lucien Devereux's practiced concern, the mask of a friend that barely concealed the vulture circling a carcass. And he saw the locket, his late Eleanor's locket, resting in Mrs. Corbett's palm like a prop in a poorly staged play. A part of him, an old, scarred part, felt the familiar sting of betrayal. The world was full of grasping hands and false faces, but when he looked at Constance Ingram, he saw none of that. He saw a woman standing as still and straight as a winter tree, her face pale, but her eyes clear. He remembered her hands, mending a curtain with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. He remembered her finding the error in the butcher's accounts, a small act of truth-telling that saved her aunt pennies and cost her peace. He remembered the quiet logic she had imposed on the chaos of his house, a logic that was beginning to seep into the chaos of his own mind. He had watched her for weeks. He had seen her coax life from the dead garden, her hands in the dirt. He had seen her treat old Hannah with a respect that had earned her the fierce loyalty of the old retainer. He had seen her close the book of his wife's accounts with a gentle reverence, respecting a grief she could not have understood. These were not the actions of a common thief. They were the actions of a person of profound and quiet substance. His mind, trained to assess threats and evidence, began to work. The timing was too perfect. Devereux's sudden concern, Mrs. Corbett's opportune discovery. It was a clumsy, obvious maneuver. Devereux wanted the estate cheap. A scandal involving the housekeeper would suggest the entire place was mismanaged, its contents insecure, its master distracted and vulnerable. It would drive the price down. Mrs. Corbett's motive was simpler: jealousy and greed. So when he asked, "Did you take this?" it was not a question born of doubt. It was a formality, a way of officially recording her testimony in the trial he was already conducting in his head. Her "no, sir," was exactly what he expected, plain, direct, and unadorned with the frantic protestations of the guilty. It was enough. The foundation of his trust in her was built of stronger stuff than a planted locket. It was built on observation, on evidence. He turned his gaze, now cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, towards her accusers. The hunt was over. The dissection was about to begin. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Return to Constance's perspective. Mr. Lockhart turned his attention from Constance to her aunt. The shift was palpable. The air in the room grew colder. "You searched my housekeeper's private belongings. In my house. Without my permission," he stated. It was not a question. Mrs. Corbett faltered, her performance crumbling under his glacial stare. "I am her guardian. I had a right." "You had no right," he cut in, his voice lethally soft. "You trespassed. Now, tell me precisely, how was this locket found?" I opened her trunk, and it was there, at the bottom." "How convenient," Lockhart murmured. He then looked at Devereux. "And you, Lucien, Your concern for my welfare is touching. When did you first hear these rumors of theft? Devereux's smile was strained. Just in the last day or so, Gideon. People talk. Indeed they do, Lockhart said. He walked over to his desk and unlocked a small drawer. The same drawer where Constance had seen him place his wife's ledger. He withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. It is a fortunate coincidence, then, that I am so methodical. This is a note in my own hand, dated 1 week ago. It records the items I personally removed from my late wife's jewelry box for cleaning and valuation. The locket is the first item on the list. I noted it missing from my desk drawer 2 days ago. Before you ever heard your rumors, Lucian, and long before you, Mrs. Corbett, performed your search. A suffocating silence descended. Mrs. Corbett's face had gone slack with shock. Devereux's handsome features were frozen in a mask of disbelief. You see, Lockhart continued, his voice a low, dangerous thrum, I have been aware of a thief at Alderbrook for several days. I simply misidentified the culprit. I had assumed a common sneak thief. It never occurred to me that it would be my neighbors and distant relations conspiring to frame an innocent woman in my own library. He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. The purpose, I imagine, was to discredit Miss Ingram, whose competence has been raising the value of this estate daily, much to your chagrin, Devereux. And for you, Mrs. Corbett, a simple case of malice, I suspect. Mrs. Corbett found her voice, a strangled squawk of denial.
It's a lie! She's bewitched you! The girl is a viper!
The girl, Mr. Lockhart said, his voice dropping even lower, is the most honest person in this room. She has brought order and light to a place that had neither, and you tried to ruin her for it. He took the locket from Mrs. Corbett's limp hand and walked over to Constance. He did not give it to her. He simply held it for a moment, then placed it back in his desk drawer and turned the key. The message was clear. It was his property, and the matter of its possession was closed. I think, he said, turning back to the two conspirators, that your visit is over. I will not have you in my house again, and I will ensure that the story of this afternoon's events is told accurately in Marley. Reputations, as you said, Mrs. Corbett, are so very fragile. It was a dismissal more absolute than any shouting could have been. Mrs. Corbett, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, grabbed her shawl and swept from the room without another word. Devereux hesitated, opening his mouth as if to offer one last, desperate defense. But he looked at Lockhart's face, saw the unyielding granite there, and thought better of it. He turned and followed Mrs. Corbett, a man whose clever scheme had just collapsed into public ruin. The great front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the now silent house. Constance stood where she was, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was safe. She was vindicated. But she felt strangely shaky, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her weak. Mr. Lockhart came to stand before her. Are you all right? He asked, his voice losing its icy edge, replaced by a quiet concern. She could only nod, unable to speak. I knew you did not take it, he said simply. How? She managed to whisper. Because I have been watching you, Miss Ingram, he replied. I watch what people do, not what they say. Your actions are honest. Theirs were not. It was a simple matter of evidence. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was trust, earned and given. And in that moment, it was the most precious thing she had ever received. The public reckoning was not long in coming. Mr. Lockhart was, as he had promised, methodical. He did not spread gossip. Instead, he arranged a small, formal dinner party the following week. The guest list was precise and strategic. He invited Lord and Lady Bellamy, the arbiters of all social matters in the county. Lady Lavinia Bellamy, in particular, was a woman whose sharp tongue, and even sharper mind, could make or break a reputation with a single pronouncement. He also invited the local magistrate, and, to the astonishment of all of Marley, Mrs. Theodosia Corbett, Philippa, and Mr. Lucian Devereux. To refuse was to admit guilt. So they came. Mrs. Corbett arrived cloaked in an air of aggrieved martyrdom, Philippa in bewildered silence, and Devereux with a strained, defiant bravado. They found themselves in the main dining room of Alderbrook, a room that had been shrouded in dust cloths a few months prior. Now it was magnificent. The long mahogany table gleamed, reflecting the light of 100 candles. The silver shone, and in the center of the table was a magnificent arrangement of late-blooming roses and rosemary from Constance's revived garden. Constance was not there as a servant. At Mr. Lockhart's insistence, she was seated at the table, near him, dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue gown he had insisted on purchasing for her from the finest dressmaker in Marley. "You are the mistress of this project," he had stated. "You will be honored as such." The dinner was an agonizingly tense affair. Lady Bellamy watched everyone with her bright, bird-like eyes, missing nothing. The magistrate ate with a stolid solemnity. Mrs. Corbett and Devereux pushed food around their plates, the conversation stilted and brittle. Finally, when the port was served, Mr. Lockhart rose. "I have not gathered you here tonight simply for a meal," he began, his quiet voice commanding immediate silence. "I have gathered you to correct a slander." He laid out the events of the previous week with cold, factual precision. He spoke of the discovered locket. He spoke of his own note, dated a week prior, proving he had known it was missing. He did not raise his voice. He simply presented the facts, one after another, like stones being laid in a wall. "Mr. Devereux has been attempting to purchase Alderbrook from me for some months, at a price I consider significantly below its value," he continued. "A price that would be more justifiable if the estate were seen as poorly managed and insecure." He then turned to Mrs. Corbett. "And Mrs. Corbett has, for her own reasons, attempted to defame the character of her own niece, a woman whose tireless work has been the sole reason for the restoration of this house." Lady Bellamy's gaze, sharp as a needle, fixed on Devereux. "Lucian," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "you always were a grasping boy, but I never took you for a clumsy one." Devereux paled. "Lady Bellamy, this is a misunderstanding. A family matter." "It ceased to be a family matter when you involved theft and slander to manipulate a property deal," the magistrate interjected, his voice heavy with disapproval. The final devastating blow came from an unexpected source. As Mrs. Corbett began to weep into her napkin, proclaiming her innocence and her love for her wayward niece, Philippa spoke for the first time. Her voice was small, but clear in the silent room. "Mother," she said, not looking at anyone, "you told me you were going to put the locket in Constance's room. You said it was to teach her a lesson, for being prideful." The confession, so simple and guileless, sucked all the remaining air from the room. Mrs. Corbett's weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by a strangled gasp. She stared at her daughter in pure, horrified betrayal. Philippa looked at Constance, her eyes full of a miserable, dawning shame. I didn't think it would be like this," she whispered. It was over. There was no defense against it. Lady Bellamy gave a small, satisfied sniff. "Well, she declared to the room at large.
That is that.
The Corbetts, I think, will not be receiving visitors for some time. And Mr. Devereux, I would advise you to take a long trip abroad. The climate on the continent is said to be excellent for one's health. It was a social death sentence, delivered with the cool precision of a guillotine. Devereux, his face ashen, rose and practically fled the room. Mrs. Corbett, supported by a still trembling Philippa, was escorted out by a footman. In the aftermath, the magistrate gave Lockhart a grim nod of approval. Handled with admirable restraint, Lockhart. Admirable. Soon, only Lord and Lady Bellamy remained. The old dowager walked over to Constance. She looked her up and down, her gaze no longer sceptical, but keenly appraising. "So," she said, "you're the one, the little grey mouse with the iron spine." She tapped Constance's arm with her fan. "You've done well. You've brought order to this mess of a house, and you've exposed a fool and a harpy. Good work." She then turned to Gideon.
"As for you, Lockhart, stop rattling around this mausoleum alone. The girl has rebuilt your house. Don't be an idiot. Marry her." And with that final, shocking pronouncement, she swept out of the room, leaving Constance and Gideon standing alone in the magnificent, candle-lit space, the scent of roses hanging in the air. The silence that descended after the guests departed was of a different quality altogether. It was not the silence of neglect, nor the tense silence of confrontation. It was a quiet space, filled with unspoken things. Constance stood by the window, looking out into the dark, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. She felt as though she had been through a storm and washed up on a strange shore. Gideon came to stand beside her. He did not speak for a long time. She could feel the warmth from his body, a solid, comforting presence in the vast room. The new curtains she had been sewing, a deep, rich wool the color of moss, were nearly finished. They lay folded over a nearby chair, waiting to be hung. A symbol of the future, not the past. "She is right, you know," he said at last, his voice low. Constance turned to him, confused. "Lady Bellamy?" "Yes." He faced her, and the formality he usually wore like armor seemed to fall away, leaving the man beneath exposed, weary, earnest, and surprisingly vulnerable. "She said you rebuilt my house. She is wrong. You did not mend it. Mending is for old curtains. You rebuilt it from the foundations up. And in doing so, you rebuilt me." He took a step closer, his gaze so direct, so full of a feeling she did not dare to name, that she could not look away. "I was a ruin, Miss Ingram. A man living in a house of ghosts. My heart was a locked room covered in dust. You came here, and you did not try to flatter or charm your way in. You simply opened the windows. You let in the light. You swept out the dust. You brought logic and order and life." He reached out, and with a startling gentleness, took her hands in his. Her hands, which were not soft or delicate, but capable and calloused from work. He held them as if they were precious things. "Constance," he said, and the use of her given name was as intimate as a kiss. "My contract with you is for 3 months. It is nearly at an end. I find that I cannot bear the thought of it ending. I cannot bear the thought of this house, or my life,
returning to silence. He took a breath, and she saw in his eyes the immense effort this declaration was costing him, a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. Lady Bellamy spoke plainly. "Allow me to do the same. I am asking you to stay. Not as my housekeeper, not as the manager of my estate. I am asking you to be my wife, to be the mistress of Alderbrook, in title as you already are in truth." He released one of her hands and gently touched her cheek. "I am not a man of poetry. I can only offer you what is real. This house, this life, my loyalty, my respect, which you have earned 10 times over, and my heart, which I thought was broken beyond repair, but which you have somehow managed to rebuild. Plainly, Constance, I am asking, will you have me?" Tears, which she had refused to shed in humiliation or despair, welled in her eyes now. Tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. She thought of the threadbare curtains in her aunt's house, of a life spent mending scraps, and she looked at this man who was offering her a world, a partnership, a home. She did not need poetry. She needed truth, and this was the truest thing she had ever known. "Yes," she whispered, the word a quiet vow in the candlelit room. "Yes. Plainly, Gideon. Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment, a wave of relief washing over his features. Then he opened them and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his grim face, making him look years younger. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about recognition. It was a promise, a homecoming, together. 1 year later, the sun streamed through the new moss-green curtains of the drawing room at Alderbrook, illuminating the vibrant life within. The house was no longer a silent, sleeping giant. It was a place of warmth and purpose and quiet joy. The gardens, under Constance's expert hand, were a wonder, supplying the kitchen with vegetables, the house with flowers, and the local apothecary with medicinal herbs. Alderbrook was becoming a flourishing enterprise, its lands productive, its accounts balanced, its future bright. Constance was not a grand lady of leisure. She was the active, respected mistress of the estate, working alongside her husband. They spent their mornings together in the study, not with him dictating and her scribbling, but with their heads bent over blueprints for a new schoolhouse in the village, their hands occasionally brushing as they pointed to a detail. Theirs was a marriage built on mutual respect, a quiet, steady partnership that was the envy of all who witnessed it. Old Hannah now ruled the kitchens with a benevolent tyranny, her loyalty to Constance absolute. Tilly and Bess were permanent, trusted members of the staff. The house was alive with the hum of happy, useful work. One afternoon, a letter arrived, bearing the postmark of a small, dreary seaside town. It was from Philippa. The handwriting was hesitant, the words stilted. "I hope this finds you well. Mother is much the same. She does not speak of Marley. I wanted to say, I am sorry, Constance, for my part in it. I was weak, and I did not understand. I am trying to be better." It was not a plea for forgiveness, not really. It was a small, imperfect acknowledgement of a great wrong. Constance read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in a small wooden box. She would not forget, but she could let it go. It was a part of the past, and her life was now firmly, joyfully in the present. Later that evening, Gideon found her in the herb garden, her sanctuary. The air was fragrant with lavender and thyme. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She smiled, leaning back against him. In her hand, she held a dented, humble tin cup she used for watering seedlings. It was an object of no value, but it was useful. It was hers. She thought of the threadbare curtains she had once been forced to mend, a task meant to remind her of her worthlessness. And she looked at the thriving garden, the warm, vibrant house behind them, and the strong arms holding her. "I was thinking," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable happiness, "about how much can be built from a ruin." Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.